Good afternoon, and single. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you for having me on this.
We appreciate you joining us today, and we're going to use this conversation to share with our community within SCN2A, but also more broadly with other epilepsies who present in the same way, just to share information about the work that you're doing and why it's so important. But I want to take a step back and introduce you. So you come from a background in communication and moved into health technology in Scotland and have been working in health technology for over 20 years. You've co-authored a book, which I understand is about to go in second edition.
We've got about 80 authors on the book, and the second edition will come out sometime next year. And I'm really thrilled it's going to be open access because it's really important that anyone who wants to read that can access it.
And that's called
Patient Involvement in Health Technology Assessment. Probably going to be on your Christmas list.
Absolutely. And also you're involved in the international organisation HTAi International, and currently the Vice President, which is fantastic, and I understand moving into a new role next year as President. I just want to start the conversation by understanding what drove you into this space. We were talking earlier about it does draw people in because it's a very interesting and often passionate area because it has such an important impact for people. So I'd love to hear a bit about the work you do and what drove you or what drew you into working in this space.
So I'll try and give you the short and rational answer. I began as a journalist for a very short and not very amazing career, but I began in there because I probably thought, you can ask questions and find out answers and make the world a better place, I suppose I thought. And then that sort of led me to think a lot about what is the basis of the claims that are made and how do you know things, those sorts of questions when you're young and have time to lie awake thinking about these things. And so I moved across into scientific organisations. And then I was overseas, I was living in Scotland, and a job came up for this thing called the Health Technology Board for Scotland, which sounded like just the sort of thing I wouldn't really be that interested in. And I went for the interview. I applied to go for interview mainly to get some practice at interviewing in a different country. And as I was preparing for it, I found out that this was something I found really incredibly interesting and very close to my interest, which is how do you reconcile different types of knowledge and know, and that's really what interested in me. So, what comes through in science, and then what does that mean for our real world and the lives we live and their messiness. And so in working in Scotland, and I was working, Dr. Karen Facey was the CEO of that organ, and she had a wonderful attitude towards patient involvement. So when I asked, shouldn't patients be part of this discussion, she was really receptive to that. She'd seen its impact with the HIV drugs and how important that patient knowledge was. And so in our very first assessment, which was on diabetic retinopathy screening, a national program for Scotland, a really important thing happened. We had a lot of opportunities to learn from people with diabetes, including patient organisation representation, and also some studies that were going on with people in diabetes and focus groups. And one of the things we realised was there was a central question around part of the procedure for screening. And in chatting to my colleagues like statisticians and the CEO, we realized that there was also something unusual about the evidence in this area as well. And so 6 months into that assessment, those assessments used to take 18 months to 2 years, we actually went back to our board. As a researcher, Kris, I think you'll appreciate how big a deal that was. And we came back with new research questions, because what we'd learned from the patient community was not different answers to our questions. We realized we were starting with the wrong questions in mind, and that had a huge impact on me. A lot of people, you have those what if moments. What if we'd gone without doing that work? We could have delivered a really strong report that was very polished and everyone thought was terrific. And it would have missed the boat, it would have missed the mark of where we needed to be, and it wouldn't have got people to screening, and it wouldn't have prevented blindness in that community. And that's just a huge idea in my mind that drives me all the time. What are the questions we aren't hearing from the patient community? What is our perspective blinding us to? And that's where patient involvement in understanding the value of healthcare is just, yeah, it's just become my passion that I couldn't shake.
It's really interesting for you to like follow that path of just curiosity, really. That curiosity and science really drew you into this space, because it is a science in many ways, which I'm out about. So that's how you were drawn into health technology, and we'll go into a bit more about what that actually is. But what is the work that you do here in Australia?
In 2016, I bumped into the wonderful Jessica Bean. Many people will know her. She lives with cystic fibrosis, and she's an amazing patient advocate, far greater than the cystic fibrosis community. And she, from her experience in Australia with trying to get access to treatment that she'd had, I think, through clinical trial at the time, got really interested in this process of health technology assessment. And so I bumped into her and a number of other people who are traveling around the country doing workshops to find out what people wanted from getting involved in this thing called health technology assessment. And I said, oh, look, you know, we're just about to publish a book on this, and I've been doing all this work sort of voluntary for overseas and on various committees and things. I would so love to support it in Australia. I just have struggled, you know, to get buy-in. And so we got talking, one thing led to another, and Patient Voice Initiative was formed as a not-for-profit, and it's there for patient organisations. And we do really two things. One is we try to build capacity just so that people have enough to equip them for being engaged in health technology assessment in the way that they want to be engaged in it. And the other thing we do is we try to provoke dialogue about what is this thing called health technology assessment, and what do we as a community want it to be? And particularly from a patient's perspective, what are they expecting of it? Because, you know, like any process, it can be improved and it can be strengthened. But it was formed by some amazing scientists who were very thoughtful about patients, like Dr. David Banter in the US in the 70s. But I think we understand patient knowledge really quite differently now. And we probably over the decades have learnt more and more about what that different perspective can mean for how we understand these processes. So I think that constant improvement conversation is about, you know, how can we improve this so that HTAi is something that's done in partnership with patient communities? And that's a big part of our work. So you can go on Patient Voice Initiative's hub. There's a Patient Voice hub. I'm sorry, it's got a sign in. It's a quick one though. And you can jump in and you can read about HTAi. You can read about giving input to different assessments. You can read about, you know, what to do when you hear about something in a pipeline. So we've got those short little topics like that. And then we also try to create opportunities for those people who want to go deeper into this. We also take phone calls. We don't have a helpline, but we have my phone number. And I often sit there and talk to people and groups about what it is they're doing and help them connect with people in the department as well who can help them. So yeah, anything we can do to give patients a voice so that they're seen, heard and valued in health technology assessment.
It's fantastic, and there's certainly a lot of resources there that are readily available either for individuals or for patient groups, and we'll make sure we pop them in the show notes and available. So you reverted to the acronym of HTAi, which we do, and there's so many acronyms in our space anyway. Could you just break down, I guess, the process and why it's important for organisations to be aware and engaged in the process?
Thank you for pulling me up on that. People talk about this thing called HTAi, and it's health technology assessment. And the first thing I want to say is that even that isn't it? Will make it, if you think, well, I don't know what that is. Yeah, even the name in full is not that much clearer. So health technologies, I should say, are any health intervention. So it could be a Band-Aid, you know, it could be the most sophisticated new drug on the market. It could be a testing process. It could be an exercise program. You know, it's anything that can diagnose or treat or prevent health illness. And so don't be thrown by the technology. Some of this stuff, it doesn't come, you know, some of this stuff doesn't need to be plugged in, I guess is what I'm saying. And some of it, and it's always, and so health technology assessment really came from this idea that you have an enormous amount of interventions come on the market. And how do you know what to use? And for someone like our government system in Australia, where a lot of our healthcare is funded under Medicare or is available on the pharmaceutical benefits list, how do you know what's good value and should go on those lists? Because you probably can't fund anything. We have a very generous health budget in Australia, I should say. You know, we spend somewhere between 12 and 17 billion on medicines alone in that system. But where do you want to spend your money to get the most value for your community? And that's really a guiding idea in health technology assessment. So it thinks about what's the clinical benefit. It thinks about ideas like cost effectiveness, which are ideas like for every unit or every dollar you spend, what's the incremental benefit? I'm not going to get into health economics because, you know, that's quite, you know, that's a whole different subject, but it's a really important about it. What is cost effectiveness? But it also, it's really setting based. And by that, I mean that health technology assessment is used by governments around the world to decide where to fund and what to fund. But we often come to different conclusions. And that's because we have different ways of delivering health system. We have different products and interventions on the market. And so a really key part of health technology assessment is taking that evidence of what's effective in clinic and what's effective in cost effective, and then thinking about, so what does that mean for the patients and the community here in Australia? And that's really where we start to realize, hang on, that can be really useful evidence, but it's only part of the story. It doesn't tell us about some of the things that are really central to patients' lives and their carers' lives, like what outcomes are most important, and why sometimes is a clinically small difference actually really quite significant to a patient community. And what happens when there's variation in the way things are provided? You know, in Australia, there's a lot of variation in the way people perhaps get a diagnosis or access to specialists. So all of those things have to come into play when you think about the value of something. You have to think about, what do we know about its value from clinical trials? We have to know, how is it going to fit within our setting? And most importantly, we have to know, what is it the patient community really values, really wants, and really needs? So it's a multidisciplinary science is the bottom line. And that discipline has to include patient knowledge.
When you first mentioned value, I was like, how do you bring the patient voice into that and quantify the value of that? I was at a meeting a couple of weeks ago, and there was some presentation around new and novel therapy, and a parent actually presented the impact that it had had on her daughter. And she started the presentation with, these are the outcome measures, and then followed it with parent reported. And she said they won't be considered, but they should be. And she went on to present all the differences that she had seen with her daughter after having this novel therapy. And it was things even to the point of only having to give her 2 medications a day instead of 10. And that was like 20 minutes back in her day, to her being able to take some steps on a walker when she was like in a wheelchair. And I mean, that's, you know, they are big things, but often how do you bring it into the conversation?
And I think that's such a useful example, because if we think about what often sits in clinical trials, clinical trials are set up from a medical scientific perspective, and we think, they often, can measure one primary outcome, and that primary outcome can be really important, but it's just a small part of the story. Health technology assessment in Australia and around the world uses this thing called a QALY. And what's important to understand that when they're looking at cost effectiveness, a QALY tries to capture the idea that not all life years are the same. So to use a really simple example, say you have surgery and you go home and you go back to work and life goes on. You don't experience pain, off you go again. That's like maybe one. That's a full life year at full health. But say you have surgery and you go home and you have to experience still a high level of pain, and perhaps there's still quite a bit of medication that you need to take, and actually you still struggle with fatigue, and you therefore maybe you work part-time. That won't be the same quality of life for the year as the other situation. And so that's measured slightly lower. And what they're trying to capture in there is that some treatments deliver a higher quality of life than others. But these are in units and in numbers, and they only tell a little bit of that story that you were referring to. So one of the quite nice things about health technology assessment is it happens in two parts, and typically, and one part is building the evidence and evaluating that more traditional scientific evidence, although it can include qualitative evidence and broader evidence, and then taking that to a committee who then can bring in more of this qualitative experience, more of that real world setting, to understand, well, okay, this walk test shows that people can walk 6 more meters. A committee might think, well, that doesn't seem very worthy. I don't think we'd pay a lot for that. But the patient community might know the true value of that 6 meters. And they might be able to bring in, even just in written input or sometimes during meetings, what that 6 meters means. And that's a really strong feature of it, because not everything can fit into economic models. You need other ways to bring data in so that you can understand this real world setting. So there is a place for that in HTAi. It's not very transparent in some settings, but there is a place, and it's a place we need to build on if we really want to understand the value to patient communities.
And I guess that leads into what place or what role can patient organisations, I guess like mine, which represents a small rare disease, so SCN2A Australia, but also potentially, other rare diseases or even more common diseases who, I guess, have therapies or technologies, as you said, coming up for consideration through these assessment processes. What can they be doing? What can we be doing? How would you, I guess, suggest going about it?
I'm going to think about 2 distinct ways, and I'll tell you in case I forget while I'm talking what the second way is I want to talk about. So the first way is what's possible to do within the system right now. Say the Pharmaceutical Benefits Advisory Committee, that's the body that decides what goes on the PBS, so typically medicines used outside of hospital, but there's also a whole lot of other funding programs. Simplicity, we'll speak about them. When they published an agenda about what they're going to look at their meetings. Okay, so I'll talk about that opportunity, and later I just want to touch on what you can do when something's in the pipeline, because sometimes, there's nothing, right? But eventually you see something and there might be something you can do then. So if something's on an agenda for being considered for reimbursement in the PBS, what you have an opportunity to do currently is to make a written submission. Now, you can just email that to the Consumer Evidence and Engagement Unit, or there is a survey on their website which asks about particular things. And it asks about things like, what's your experience of current treatment? You know, what are the things that are hardest to live with? What would you want from a treatment? And so you can provide that input. One of the things, sorry, you might want to edit that bit. One of the things we have at Patient Voice Initiative that can be helpful to people here is we have little modules where you can get an idea of what sort of information can be really helpful to put in your written submission. And so say there's something on their agenda. This is what I would do first. I would first try and find out as much as possible about the product. At the moment, there's not much on the agenda. Now, your community members might already know quite a lot. They might have been watching something coming and know quite a bit about it. But if I was a patient organisation, I would contact the pharmaceutical company that had applied to have the drug listed on the PBS. And I would ask them for information about which population it's intended for. If they can tell us more about the intervention, including, you know, what the data is around benefits and side effects or adverse events. I would want to know, what's it being compared to? Something I haven't mentioned is that health technology is a assessment is a comparative assessment. We always compare a new intervention to something that's already in the system, and then they work out its relative value. Is it worth displacing this one for this one? Or it doesn't mean you take one out, by the way. It's just compared about it so it can understand the value of it. So what's it being compared to? Is that what your members or yourself is currently using, or is that not terribly relevant? There's always something to make a comment on there. Outcomes. What are the outcomes that have been captured in the evidence? So you can think about, what are the outcomes that are most meaningful to your community? There might be additional outcomes you want to mention. So I always start there. Then when you've got that, I would contact the Consumer Evidence and Engagement Unit, which sits within the Department of Health. They have an email that you can contact. What I want to know from them is, they've seen the application. What's not really in it that would be really helpful? And I would focus on that. And then I would start to think about what it is that your community knows, maybe through your support group, maybe through research you've done, maybe through a whole range of other, you know, ways that you know what's going on in your community. What your community would think about that assessment and would add to that assessment that would help people understand the value of it. So maybe it's that a comparator is there, but people don't really understand the burden of using that comparator. Yeah. Maybe it's that there's a pathway to treatment that's being presumed that actually is not typical, or not typical for some of your members who might be left out and not get the treatment if it's presumed that everyone can access something in a similar way. Maybe it's about an outcome that really matters, that your community thinks is associated with this treatment, that isn't sitting there in the evidence. It can be many of those things, but you don't need to put in input that repeats the science, but it's really important to interpret the science with your real world knowledge of what goes on. So that's the main way at the moment that you can get involved.
Yeah, then you talked about pipelines. So I guess
when a treatment is for a rare population, you know, it's a smaller population group. So the clinical trials don't come with the same level of certainty as when you have a large population group. You know, it's difficult to recruit people. It's a small population. And there's also a lot of unknowns about rare diseases. So committees don't see your condition. They haven't seen it before. They don't understand what it's about. So they really, in rare, need all this information. You know, it's much more important to be involved and to be informing it. And what we find is that when communities become aware of something, it might be that some of your community has been in a clinical trial, or that you're in an online support group with people overseas and people are talking about something and it's sounding like it's starting to look quite promising, or it's going to the FDA for regulation in the States, and you start to see, hey, there might finally be something in our area. It's a really good idea to start getting your ducks in a row, because typically, unfortunately, it's quite a while sometimes before we see these treatments in Australia. But I think it's useful to get ready to help wave to the company and say, come to Australia, we're getting ready for this treatment, which we think might be of value to our community. And that's something you're going to discover as you learn more about it. But at that point, I think it's really important to introduce yourself to the company who's likely to bring it to Australia. There'll be real limits about how they can connect at that stage, because it hasn't got more marketing authorization in Australia. But introduce yourself, take that time to find out who in the company do I speak to, what are the rules they have around this. Finding people takes time. I would also contact Consumer Evidence and Engagement Unit again, and I would talk to them about your interest in something coming and get some tips about what sort of information might be useful. I would stock take. I would see, what do we know about this treatment? And when I'm stock taking, I would be reaching out. If you know of a group like yours anywhere in the world, I would be reaching out to them to ask them what they've got on it. Well, so, do you have natural history? A lot of the time, no. Is this a time that you could be building that? I would be trying to connect with researchers for two different reasons. I would be looking at what we know and what might be useful to know by the time it comes here. So maybe some of that comes from scientific research. Some of that might come from qualitative research to better understand the needs of the community. So I would be trying to build my evidence base in that time. And most importantly, I would be building my networks, and I would be checking in with those people, because people change positions. And once we know it's coming, things will start moving fast. But there's a real opportunity when things are still in the pipeline to start building and reinforcing your knowledge of your community and what matters most and where the need is. Looking at, do we even know our numbers? Knowing your numbers for how many people in your community is really important. If there's, variations, what are they? And do we know numbers there? I think all of that's really important. And starting to build your community's awareness of what the process will look like, and building realistic expectations for that process, because I know that patient organisations, it's a really tough thing to manage everyone's expectation. So those are some of the things I would start by doing. And again, I don't mean to flog the hub, but there is a short 15 minutes. These are a couple of critical moves you can take in that time.
I just want to tease you out a little bit around the expectations. Are you talking timelines? Are you talking that not every drug that goes through the assessment process becomes available? I mean, that's not realistic, but what are we kind of talking to our communities about around expectation?
A lot of the things you point to. So one is timelines. Straight up, we always have this discussion about timeliness. The time for communities it takes to get access to a medicine is not an institution timeline. It is from the moment you see something and you think it could really be valuable. So understanding that a company may not even choose to bring it to Australia, and that's the very first job, is to get them interested in coming, and to find out whether it's coming, to understand just a little bit about what it needs to go through and why. So before it's sold, it needs to go through regulation at TGA. And then to understand a little bit about what it will be to be affordable. And that means getting it, say, on the pharmaceutical benefits list. Then there's a couple of other expectations there. You probably at that stage don't have access to good data. You know, the longer something is around, the more we learn about it. And sometimes we learn that something isn't as promising as we hoped. That something can be in that timeline. It can even get accelerated access through the American regulation because everyone thinks it's so promising. But actually the data can come out later and it wasn't supported. So there's disappointment there. So we need to be realistic that when things are early pipeline, we're hoping, but there's a lot we don't know. And things can be 20 years on the market and we learn more and more. So when things are early, we don't know a lot. We also don't know what the company wants to charge for it. We don't know what they will, you know, say it's worth in terms of dollars. And when you've got a lot of uncertainty around a treatment, particularly as you often do in rare areas, how does the HTAi process, how does that committee make sense of the evidence they've got with the price that the company will charge? And we don't have a lot of influence over that. That amount might be set not even in Australia. It may be a decision made offshore. So we don't have control over that. The thing we have control over is how much we want to get involved. And I think that is a decision because it's time consuming. And how we want to express the value and share our knowledge about its value. But every HTAi brings together this economic evidence, this clinical evidence, the organizational setting, like how does it fit within our current health system, and the consumer, the patient perspective. And all four of those things need to come together to make it work. Does that mean it won't get through if it's really expensive? No, because there is the life-saving drugs program, which says that if something has clinical benefit, it can be considered. So that's one way. The other thing is, if you look at it, some very expensive treatments are funded. And they're funded sometimes because all those elements come together. If I give you a quick example, for the SMA community, you know, we know those treatments are expensive. That community did something incredibly valuable. They put together a report which actually documented the adult experience, and people within the system told me that that was incredibly helpful for understanding what the value of some of these treatments would be. So it's sort of that all four things come together. And I'd always say to people in the patient community, you feel the weight of the world on your shoulders, or at least your community, when there's something coming through that your community is really hoping to access. But remember, you've got to share it with everyone, because it's not down to you to get it across the line. You know, what you can do is you can challenge assumptions and bring knowledge to bear. And that's what everyone in that system is doing. And it comes down to how it works out together. So that's sort of what I would say around expectations. We also know that when something's first in class, that typically it takes a number of resubmissions into the system. And so although the process is technically 17 weeks long, it could take 2 years if a number of resubmissions are required by the company. Although I'll caveat that there are some early resolution processes. I think everyone will fall asleep if I get into that, but just be prepared. Sometimes it can take a long time, but it doesn't mean that you can't push for it to be sooner.
I think that's really helpful to both sort of understand what organisations can do in a practical sense and towards the process, but also in supporting their community through the process as well, by managing expectations. I know that you, like me, are very passionate about that patient voice and embedding that in what we do and kind of being guided by that. And you were part of a recent review of the health technology assessment review and looking at the process and how it works. Where I don't want to go too far into it, but I just want to touch on what your hopes are that that come from this review, and maybe particularly focusing on that patient perspective that we're both so passionate about?
It's an opportunity to improve it. You know, these are big machines, and it was a real opportunity to show what the patient communities were sort of expecting of HTAi. I think we've never had as well organized, as well informed patient community as we have at this point. And health technology assessment has been a bit of a black box where people can't quite see what's going on, and people have uneven levels of knowledge. And I think we heard from patient communities that they really want to be partners in health technology assessment. That doesn't mean everybody wants to be it, of course. They want that opportunity to be there and to be heard. And so we have some processes, as I mentioned, already in place to do that. There's a lot more we could do to refocus it so that it's really about getting the best outcomes for patients in an equitable and efficient and quality service. And so I thought there was opportunity there. One of the opportunities there is about timelines. You know, that people within the department and the committees work incredibly hard to complete assessments in 17 weeks, but it's not usually 17 weeks for us to actually access. And so I felt that that was something important. One of the really important recommendations, I'd say, that comes out of the review to me is around timeliness. And one of them is about establishing an interim fund for those areas that are looking like they will be really a treatment that will looking really positive when we've got high unmet clinical need here, that it looks a bit like a very confident decision. And rather than waiting for all the assessment to be complete and every dot to be dotted, to actually set up an interim fund that enables people to access that while the government and the company negotiate the price. And that to me is an important one, especially in pediatrics and rare, where it's such a horrific thing if you know something's available and you can't access it in time and the opportunity is lost. So that's so timeliness. Also around timeliness around when states need to implement the recommendations of MSAC, the Medicare Advisory Medical Services Advisory Committee. At the moment, there's no set timeline, but within the review, there's recommendations to have a fixed timeline so that wherever you are in Australia, you'll have more equitable service, and also that those recommendations are more likely to be implemented. There's also some really important stuff about transparency, and I think that's really something that I hoped for strongly in the review, and a lot of people in patient communities did. How is that input that we were talking about, how is it taken account of alongside the other evidence? And then how were values traded and balanced to reach the decision? And what other information did you have that we would have been helpful for us in giving our input and commenting on? So transparency is a really good big part of it there. At the same time, there was the enhanced consumer co-design work going on about improving that consumer involvement. I think that's a really important piece for effective relationships and meaningful relationships with the patient community. And another key aspect about it was really trying to front load the system. So, you know, we were talking before about it's just 17 weeks and it's really hard to achieve all sorts of really great input during that time. But if we reintroduced horizon scanning and the patient community was a partner in that, we could start bringing their perspective to bear earlier. This would help with patient communities knowing what is missing from the evidence. And when we've got those really disruptive, those innovative treatments, you know, we might want to work out ways to prioritize their movement into the health system and to prepare for them better, rather than just trying to react to them when they come through in health technology assessment. I think there's a lot there that can be done so that it's a more seamless system, a more transparent system, and a system that can is much better set up to learn from patient knowledge.
It sounds like a good ambition for that review. Do you have any indication of implementation of the review?
So we know that the government is setting up an implementation group, and I imagine everyone is thinking they're on it or wants to be on it in this area. Probably a lot of people don't want to be on it too, but that will be an implementation group. We don't know then about the specifics, because in my mind, and I don't have any particular knowledge here, but just to set the expectation reasonably, there are 50 recommendations coming out of the HTAi review alone, and some of them have a number of levels to them, and they're interconnected. So there will be some things that quite quickly could be done, but there are other things that are quite a lot of restructuring and reform. And the key to all of it is co-design, like working with us to do this. So for example, if you're thinking about something like the interim bridging fund, we'd want to set criteria about what is included in that. And you can see that talking to patient communities and involving them and setting that criteria to make them reasonable is a really big part. So it's a big job, but there are some things that are smaller. So I think there'll be an implementation group. I sort of imagine there'll have to be other working groups to get down into the nitty-gritty of this. But the government's committed to an implementation group. They haven't come out with a response to individual recommendations. So I feel that there's a real opportunity for patient communities at the moment to push for those things, those recommendations that they see as really essential to be implemented.
Yeah. Okay, I'll make sure that we share a link to the review as well for those that want to dive a bit deep. I'm going to stop there because I have taken up a lot of your time today, but I just want to give you the opportunity. Is there anything else that you want to share around, I guess, HTAi and patient organisations about yourself, or really just open it to you to close up today?
I guess that's what I'd say is that we've talked about all sorts of things today, and some of your community will know these things well and want to go deeper, and other people will be, oh, perhaps I should have sat down to listen to that one, But the key thing about health technology assessment is it's trying to determine the value of health interventions, and that has many dimensions to it. But patient communities have this knowledge about what really matters, and it doesn't have to be a scientific knowledge. It's a knowledge that comes from lived experience. It's a knowledge that comes from navigating your way through, the health system, and patient communities often know more about how this health system works on the ground than a lot of other people. And that can really help us understand value, help us understand where we want to invest as a community in our Medicare, in our PBS. And so there's a lot of terminology. Immediately, if you get into this, someone will tell you it's complex. But actually, if you understand something about the value of something and you're in a position to share it, it's a really helpful thing to do.
That's really helpful. I have one quick question just on that before we finish up. I work in the paediatric space, and also a lot of the patients are cognitively impaired. So how do you get value out of those patients? Is the caregiver voice a way in which we can feed the importance and value of these treatments and technologies into the HTAi system?
The caregiver voice is incredibly important. Often people can't bring this knowledge forward themselves, and so it's a really important thing. And actually the separate, so giving voice to people who aren't able to give voice is a really important role, but also speaking to the caregiver role is really important. That's not measured in the economic analysis, but it is discussed in the committee about what it is. I think the other thing is that there is good research going on with people with cognitive impairment, and it's not my area of expertise, but there is good research to be able to hear that voice as well. We're shortly going to do webinar on patient-based evidence, and we're hoping to hear just a couple of insights just to open that up a bit. Is there something? Because from some communities, you know, there is communication that's happening between carer and the person with the condition. And so we could be learning there as well. We have to think about burden for everyone in this,
Yeah.
but we certainly don't want to exclude that voice, and we need to get smarter about how we include it. And that might include also doing research that can be really sustainable, that might help your community in health technology assessment, but also in developing the policy that really works for your community.
I really want to thank you for your time, Anne, because I know you're busy and the work that you're doing is really important, but I really wanted to highlight that today as well. And I think just in finishing, you used the word burden, and I think it is important for either patients or patient organisations to be not wary of the process, but be cognizant of it is work on top of what is often a volunteer role, which is often on top of parenting or, you know, being a consumer of a health condition as well. And so to really recommend that if you're going into this process to lean into the supports like what patient voice initiative provide, because it's really valuable, and you've done a lot of the scaffolding that makes so much easier for organizations like us. And so yeah, definitely recommend people to leaning into that, and other peak bodies that support your organization as well, who will have more experience in this process too.
That's great advice. And thank you so much for all the work you do, Kris. And it's just impressive.
I enjoy being around people who also champion that patient and consumer voice. So you surround yourself with people who have the same values and want to see that change made. So thank you.
My pleasure.